So we're now in the month of Shvat, which means that BiShvat, the festival of trees, is coming soon. And so in honor of BiShvat, we're going to talk tonight about trees. No surprise. And we're also going to talk a bit about the environment. So that'll be exciting. But first, I want to start with a beautiful Gemara about the connection between Torah and trees. So let's start with that. Let me share a screen to get started. Okay. So there's a Gemara in Tanit that goes as follows. It says, Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak, Lama nimshalu divrei Torah ke'etz. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, why are the words of Torah likened to a tree? So Shneimar, as it says, Etz chaim hi l'machazikim ba, right? The line we all know, that it is talking of the Torah, is a tree of life for those who claim it. Lomar lach, to tell you, ma etz katan madliket hagadol. Just as a small tree, if it's on fire, can light a larger tree. Af talmidei chachamim ktanim mechadedim et hagdolim. So too, even minor scholars can sharpen greater scholars, or sharpen the learning, let's say, of greater scholars. V'hainu de'amar Rabbi Chanina, and that is in keeping with what Rabbi Chanina said, Harbe lamadti mirabotai, u'mechaverai yoter mirabotai, mitamidai yoter mikulan. He says, I've learned much from my teachers, and from my friends, I have learned even more than from my teachers, and from my students, I've learned more than from all of them. Okay, so let me stop sharing. So, why is Torah compared to a tree? The Gemara asks. We saw that this beautiful thought that when it comes to learning Torah, we all have something to contribute. It doesn't matter if you're a big deal or a regular Joe. What matters is that you bring the fire. And everyone has something to contribute. As the Gemara says, I've learned much from my teachers, more from my friends, and the most from my students. Why is that? So perhaps one way of thinking about it is that the image of a tree helps us understand it. That when you think about a tree, all trees reach up toward the same place, right? Towards the heavens. All trees share the same energy source above, the same source of light. But the shape and the path of each tree is different. And the shape of each tree depends on a lot of things. What kind of seed it started from, where it was planted, where its roots lie, what the soil is, what environment it grows in. And so too in Torah, we all start from different places. And that means that even as we all reach upward, so to speak, toward the same source of energy, each of us does so starting from a different place. And that means that each of us will wind up traveling a different path, even if we're all reaching for the same thing. And maybe that's why you can learn from anyone, small or big, because their Torah has different roots than yours. And so they bring perspectives that you might never have come to based solely on your own personal journey. And often it's actually by talking to people that are different from ourselves that we actually come to understand ourselves better. Okay, so Torah and trees have a deep connection. That's really, it's a bit of a tangent, but really just a beautiful little nugget, I thought, to get us started in a tree-loving and Torah-loving kind of mood. Now let's kind of get to the main event of this year. So tonight we're going to start by looking at a line from the Torah, also involving a tree, where Chazal do something very interesting. They take what appears to be a rather narrow, esoteric law, and they derive from it a much bigger principle and really a halachic concept that affects our lives every day. Okay, so let's start with the pasuk that we're going to learn from. So it says in Parshat Shoftim, in Dvarim, it says, Ki tatsur al ir yamim rabim lehilachem aleha letafsa. When you besiege a city, this is talking about the laws of war. This is a section of the Torah talking about the laws of war. It says when you besiege a city for many days to make war upon it in order to capture it. Lo tashchit et etzah lindoach alav garzen. don't destroy its trees. This is the key line, lo tashchit, don't destroy its trees. Don't wield an axe against those trees. Ki mimenu tochal ve'oto lo tichrot, because you should eat from it and you shouldn't cut it down. And then there's this very interesting line. It says, Ki ha'adam etz hasadeh lavo mipanecha b'matzor. This is actually a little bit of a hard line to translate, but it's something like this. It says, because is a tree like a person that can run away behind the siege walls? Maybe that's one way to, right? It's almost like with a question mark at the end. Because is a tree like a person that it can run away from you? Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth, what that's getting at. But clearly it's a line that really calls out to you to try to understand it, as if it's almost like asking you to dig deeper. Okay, and then we'll just read the next pasuk. It says, Rak etz asher teda ki lo etz ma'achalhu. Only trees that you know are not fruit producing. Oto tashchit v'charata. Those you're allowed to cut them down. Uvanita matzor ala ir asher hi osa imcha milchama ad ridta. And you can use those trees to create the siege works by which you will go to war and ultimately win against this city. Okay, so that's the line from the Torah that we're going to see some explanations. So let's think of it a little bit about what we just saw. Specific rule in a specific case having to do with a siege. The Torah says don't cut down fruit-bearing trees, and it has this interesting worded line, like it's trying to get us to focus. But the bottom line is that that it's telling you that it's telling us a law that we might think we might never use in our lives. I guess that's one way, when you first read that, you say, well, I'm never going to be in a siege, so I don't know that this law is ever going to apply to me, whether I can cut down a fruit tree or a non-fruit bearing tree. But these psukim are the source for a much broader halachic concept of bal tashchit. So that is the prohibition against being wasteful in general. So for Chazal, fruit trees in war are just an example. The broader principle is don't be wasteful, don't be callously destructive in general. Okay? And this concept is found in a number of places in Shas. That when the Torah in Parshat Shoftim tells us lo tashchit et eitzah, don't cut down the trees that surround this besieged town. Okay, what it's really hinting at is a broader idea that we shouldn't be destructively wasteful in general, in war, in life, anytime. So let's give a few examples. So the Gemara in Kiddushin, for example, tells a story of Rav Chizda, who wanted apparently to test his son's patience. So he took some expensive garments and he tore them up right in front of his son, basically just to see if it would make his son mad. And then the Gemara comes and asks a question. It says, well, wait a second. How can Rav Chizda have done that? Isn't tearing up a perfectly good garment a violation of bal tashchit? Again, using that same term basically as what the Torah had said about destroying trees, but here it's talking about ripping something up. But basically the Gemara is saying, how can he be so wasteful? How can he be so wantonly destructive? Okay. Now, in that story, the Gemara resolves its own question by saying that Rav Chizda must have been mindful of that prohibition, right, of not being wasteful, of bal tashchit. So therefore, the Gemara says that he must have torn the garment along the lines of its seams in a way that could easily be restitched. Because Rav Chizda would never have just destroyed a garment in this wasteful way. Okay, so in that case, Rav Chizda's in the clear. In that case specifically, Rav Chizda's in the clear. But the Gemara's question shows us that the rabbis were on the lookout for prohibited wastefulness, which they termed bal tashchit. Again, from the same term that the Torah used, talking about a very specific case of a tree during a siege. And there are a handful of Gemaras that use the term bal tashchit in this way, as a prohibition on wasteful destruction generally, not just fruit trees, but waste of any kind. Now, we should note, the Gemara is careful to point out that we actually shouldn't take the concept of bal tashchit too far, which you might do, okay, that we shouldn't just overreact in our quest to root out wastefulness everywhere. So I'll give some examples of that. So the Torah talks specifically about the situation of a siege, but the Gemara elsewhere in Bava Kama extends this idea to say you shouldn't cut down fruit-bearing trees in general, whether it's in a siege or not a siege. Okay, it's a more general rule. Basically, don't cut down fruit trees. But there, the Gemara goes on to say that if the value of the lumber from cutting down the tree is greater than the value of the fruit that will ever come from that tree, then it's actually okay to cut down the tree. Okay, because that kind of tree cutting, it seems, is not considered wasteful. If the lumber is worth so much more than the tree, then maybe you might say it would be wasteful not to cut down the tree for that purpose. So I guess what the Gemara is getting at is that the context is important. And it seems that the Gemara is implying some kind of cost-benefit analysis that we should do when we think about whether it's more wasteful to cut down a tree as the baseline, or maybe sometimes it would be at least acceptable to do so. Okay, another example from the Gemara. There's a Gemara in Shvat where the Gemara quotes and then rejects actually a very strict view about Bal Tashchit that's attributed to Rav Chisda. Okay, the Rav Chisda. Bonus points for anyone who picked up that this is the same Rav Chisda that we met before, who was tearing up shirts in front of his son to test his son's patience. Okay, so in that case, Rav Chisda seemed to be kind of lenient. Maybe he was careful about tearing on the lines. But anyways, in the Gemara in Shabbat, Rav Chisda says a very interesting thing. He says, someone who's able to eat barley bread, but instead eats wheat bread, violates Bal Tashchit. Interesting. If you eat fancy bread, basically, instead of basic bread, your extravagance is wasteful. And Rav Chisda says that is Bal Tashchit. That is unpermissible wastefulness. Okay, and then Rav Papa comes on and he piles on. He says, anyone who's able to drink beer and instead drinks wine also violates Bal Tashchit. Okay, so don't drink your fancy wine when beer would be okay, says Rav Papa. But what's interesting is that you have these two opinions that seem super, super strict. Any kind of indulgence, it seems, even wheat bread, that is wasteful. The Gemara comes in over the top, which is really quite rare. Okay, the Gemara comes in over the top and in its own voice, not quoting anyone, says "Vilav miltahi," says, and that is not correct. These opinions are not correct. Bal Tashchit de gufa aduf. Okay, so what does that mean? The Gemara chimes in at the end and disagrees strongly and says, no, enjoying nice physical things in the world is not inherently wasteful. Even treats, even delicacies. Okay, literally translated, it means it's not correct. The prohibition of Bal Tashchit against one's body takes precedence. Presumably what the Gemara is saying is that to let your body go to waste, presumably this means to let your sense of taste, maybe your capacity for physical enjoyment, to let your physical self go to waste would be an even greater example of Bal Tashchit. Okay, so don't worry, enjoying some of the finer things is okay. You could enjoy your wine and even your wheat bread, your fine wheat bread. Okay, so anyways, all of that just gives you a background of Bal Tashchit in the Torah, about trees, in a siege, and then Bal Tashchit in the broader sense of what the rabbis kind of expand from that. So now tonight, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at two very different types of explanations from different sources that give very different explanations of what this law of Bal Tashchit is about. Okay, so we'll have to go through them. We're going to go through the sources and then we'll see what they mean. But you'll see that they're really, really different ways of thinking about what this mitzvah is about. Okay, so let's start. We're going to leave the times of the Gemara. We're going to go to the times of the Rishonim in the medieval period. And again, we're going to see two very different readings of what Bal Tashchit is about. Let's start with the Rambam. Okay. Okay, so this is the Rambam codifying these laws of Bal Tashchit. And he says, Ein kotzatzim ilanei machal shechutz lamedina ve'ein monim mehem amat tamayim kedei sheyivshu. So basically, don't cut down trees and don't cause them to die out by stopping their water source. Basically, don't destroy trees surrounding around a city. Shenemar lo tashchit et eitzah. We saw that. That's the line that we looked at before. V'chol hakotzetz lokeh. And anyone who does this receives lashes, which is another way of saying basically they violated a Torah law. V'lo b'matzor bilvad. And the Rambam says, we're not just talking about a siege. Ella, b'chol makom, kol hakotzetz ilan ma'achal derech hashchata lokeh. In any circumstance, if somebody cuts down a fruit-bearing tree, that person receives lashes, essentially has broken a Torah law. Okay. And then aval, but kotzetzimoto im hayam mazik ilanot acherim. But if that tree was causing basically a nuisance, was causing other damage to other trees, you can cut it down. O mipnei shemazik b'steh acherim. Or similarly, if it's creating a nuisance to the neighbor, okay. O mipnei shedamav yekarim. Or if the value of cutting it down and selling it would be worth more, then so too, maybe we can cut it down. Lo asra Torah ela derech hashchata. The Torah only prohibited cutting down trees in a way that is derech hashchata, basically in a way that is destructive. And destructive, you can see, means that there are various reasons why it might be okay. Maybe it's a nuisance, maybe it's worth more, but you certainly can't do it in a wasteful way. Okay, and then the Rambam goes on further. He says, Kol ilan srak mutar lakotzoto. But if you have a non-fruit-bearing tree, you're allowed to cut it down, even if you don't have a big need for it. V'chen ilan ma'achal shehizkin ve'enu oseh ela davar mu'at. And so too, if you have an old tree that isn't really producing much fruit anymore, she'eno ra'ui litroach bo, and it's not worth the effort of maintaining it, mutar lakotzoto. So too, you're allowed to cut it down. And then he goes through some details of like exactly how much is fruit bearing, how much is enough fruit bearing that you should be careful. Okay, and then the next halacha, this is the last one we're going to go through from the Rambam, he says, V'lo ha'ilanot bilvad. And we're not just talking about trees, ela kol hameshaber kelim, anyone who breaks utensils or vessels, the koreh b'gadim, or tears clothes, that's the Rav Chizda story, the hores binyan, or destroys a building, v'sotem mayan, or stops up a well, me'abed machalot derech hashchata, or wastes food in a wasteful way, over belo tashchit. In all these cases, they are violating this prohibition of bal tashchit, do not destroy, literally, don't be wasteful. But then he says, with regard to all of these non-tree extensions, ve'enu lokeh, but those are not Torah laws, ela makat mardut midivrehem. Those extensions are midirabanan, he's pointing out, basically. These are not, the Torah itself was talking about something narrow, the rabbis expanded it to be something broader. But anyways, what we take away from the Rambam is that again, he starts with the trees in siege. He starts with the fruit bearing, expanded out according to the rabbis. But he does point out that there's some kind of cost benefit analysis that you're supposed to be doing. There's some calculus that determines whether you're being wasteful. And the violation of the law is if you are being wasteful. Okay, and let's go through one more source in the same. You know how I said there are going to be two different kind of teams, two different camps. Let's go through one other source that's an even stronger version on what we're going to call, the kind of the Rambam side of this. And this is actually from the Ramban. So this is always confusing, just so we're all on the same page. Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He lived in Muslim Spain and then eventually in Egypt. That was the first source. Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, lived in Christian Spain over 100 years later, and then eventually moved to the land of Israel. Okay, so Ramban has, among the many things that he wrote, he has a book in which he looks at Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvah. Rambam put together a list of 613 mitzvah. Okay, Ramban comes later, and he has a commentary in which he says, here are all the ways in which Rambam's count of the 613 mitzvah are wrong. He's got all these notes, basically. And so this note is Ramban's note, omitted positive commandment number 6. Okay, so he thinks that Rambam should have included this as a separate law. But anyways, with all that as background, here's what Ramban has to say. He says, as we were commanded to be concerned about it, the way we would be concerned about our own. So meaning, we should be concerned about this tree, Nachmol al Shalanu. We should, Kasher Nachmol al Shalanu. We should have as much kind of mercy upon this tree as if it were ours, even though we're besieging the city, right? But why? Here's the kicker. Ulai nachboshotam. Maybe we will conquer the city, and therefore we'll want to have that tree later on after we win. Aval, however, betzeitenu me'al eretz oyev, when we're leaving enemy territory, let's say we have no intent to ever conquer this land. We just went in and we won some battles, and now we're leaving. Nashchit v'nachbol kol etz tov. You're actually allowed, according to Ramban, to destroy any tree that you want. A scorched earth policy is totally fine on the way out, okay? Likewise, during the days of the siege, it's permitted to hurt the people of the city by the destruction of the trees so that they will not live off of them, okay? And here's the line, Lo asra Torah ella hashchata bechinam. The only thing, according to the Ramban's interpretation, that the Torah outlawed was destruction for no reason. It's a pretty low bar. It's a pretty low bar. Okay, so I'm going to stop with that, and let's take it in. Okay, so Ramban again has this view, which is interesting and somewhat surprising, I would say. The Torah says, don't cut down fruit trees during a siege. What did those trees ever do to you? Can they run away and hide behind the siege walls? Okay. It seems that the Torah is trying to get across that even though it might at first seem to make sense to you to cut these trees down, pause, think about it, wait, maybe you should reconsider. Are you just being wasteful? And if so, don't do it. Okay. Ramban understands the Torah to be saying, don't cut these trees down for no reason, bechinam. But if I have a reason, I can cut them down. That's different. Okay, now you might ask, on the Ramban's perspective, so isn't the whole point of the Torah law to tell you that sometimes you're going to think that you have a good reason to cut these trees down during the siege, but you still shouldn't do it? Now, the Torah is not particularly clear on this point. It didn't say anything about a cost-benefit analysis. It said don't cut down fruit-bearing trees during a siege. You can cut down non-fruit-bearing trees in order to build siege works. Okay, so you can see how he could have got to that. But in any case, Ramban's explanation gives you a sense of how far you might be willing to go if your understanding of the law of Bal Tashchit is based on a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, if the tree is worth more standing, leave it. If it's more useful, cut down. You can cut it. So that this kind of cost-benefit way, let's say, is one way in which the rabbis understood, or at least some rabbis understood, the law of Bal Tashchit. Don't destroy things wastefully, maybe for no reason, depending on how you want to formulate it. But so that's kind of one camp. But there's another way of understanding the Torah's prohibition of cutting down fruit trees, which is really, really different. Okay, another way is to say that the Torah is telling us more than just that we should do the math and make sure it's worthwhile before we cut down the tree. And in some ways, this reading is more intuitive, right? Instead, the Torah is telling us more firmly, don't cut down productive fruit trees, even when, and you might even say especially when, you really want to. Okay, so for that, now let's go through another opinion that's going to lay this out in more detail. We'll see that it's quite different. Okay, so let's go through the view of Sefer HaChinuch. Okay, Sefer HaChinuch, just as background. Sefer HaChinuch literally means the book of education. It was a book written anonymously in 13th century Spain, and its style is of a father teaching all the mitzvot of the Torah to his child. Okay, so the book goes mitzvah by mitzvah. For each mitzvah, we get an introduction, and then we get a description of the roots of the mitzvah, basically some exploration of the mitzvah's underlying rationale, okay, the roots of the mitzvah, and then we get a bunch of explanations of various practices of the mitzvah itself. So this is mitzvah number 529 out of 613, to not destroy fruit trees. It starts with what we know. It says that we've been prevented from chopping down fruit trees when we besiege a city, okay, to distress the people of the city and to sadden their hearts. That's interesting. You're kind of showing how harsh you are. by his formulation is, don't cut down these trees so that the people behind the walls don't see you doing it, and that makes them feel like, wow, you're like really serious about this siege. Okay, but then when he gets down below to the Shoresh HaMitzvah, he says, interesting, he says, Shoresh HaMitzvah Yadua. The root of the commandment, the basis of this commandment is well known, it's understood. This is what he says. It's going to be totally different than what the Rambam and Ramban had to say. He says, it's in order to teach our souls to love good and benefit and to cling to it. And through this, good clings to us, and we'll distance ourselves from all bad and destructive things. I'm going to read the whole thing and then we'll go back, okay? And this is the way of the pious and people of proper action. It says, V'zehu derech hachasidim ve'anshei ma'aseh, ohavim shalom. They love peace. V'smechim b'tov habriot, and they love what's for the good of the creatures of the world, okay? And to bring them close to Torah. And they don't destroy even a grain of mustard in the world. And they're distressed by all loss and destruction that they see. And if they can prevent it, they will prevent any destruction with all of their strength. But not so are the wicked, the brothers of the destructive spirits. They rejoice in the destruction of the world, and they destroy themselves. Okay. So, wow, very, very different explanation from the chinuch. It seems that for the chinuch, the problem of Baal Tashchit is not exactly just wastefulness, not just, I'm going to say, a utilitarian concern, not kind of like specifically the way a philosopher might use that term, but you get a sense when he says that it's the way of the pious not even to destroy a grain of mustard. As a rule, we should not be destructive. The message is destructive behavior leads to a destructive personality. So again, notice how different these two understandings of Baal Tashchit are. Rambam and Ramban, even stronger, their concern seemed to be that wasteful destruction leads to bad outcomes. Don't cut down that tree because someday you, or maybe your children, will wish that you hadn't done so. You might need that tree later, okay? Waste not, want not. This is really good advice in general. The Torah is giving you a rule to live by, which is for your own good, even if you don't see it at the time. Pause, do the math, make sure you're not being wasteful, because wastefulness in the end is bad for you, okay? The chinuch's explanation is very different. For him, wastefulness is problematic because it leads to bad character traits. Wastefulness is the way of the wicked. Wastefulness is a symptom of a broader sense, you could say, of callousness or lack of appreciation. It's not that you'll be sorry later that you didn't have that tree. It's deeper than that. It's that destroying something good is inherently a bad thing to do. It's the way of the wicked, so just don't do it. With some exceptions, okay? But as a rule, let's say, you shouldn't do it. So we've seen two very different ways of looking at the law of Baal Tashchit. Okay, now, here's something interesting. We find a very similar disagreement about two different ways of understanding yet another mitzvah. And it's actually another mitzvah that has to do with the way that we interact with the environment and the natural world, okay? And that is with respect to the laws of Shemitah, okay? We're gonna see the same two teams line up in the way that they explain the laws of Shemitah. And Shemitah, just as a reminder, is the sabbatical year, the seventh year of each calendar, right? Every 7 years, according to the Torah, you take a break from working your field. And in the same way as we work for 6 days and we take the seventh day off, so too, we work the land for 6 years and we take the seventh year off. Okay, but the question is why? Why do we take the seventh year off? So we're going to go through the same thing. Let's go through the Rambam's explanation. Rambam says, this is in Moreh Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed. He says, as the precepts enumerated in the laws concerning the years of release and the jubilees, are translations of Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. Okay, some of them imply sympathy to our fellow men and promote a well-being of mankind. For in reference to these precepts, it is stated in the law, so it says in the Torah, that the poor of thy people may eat. So we'll actually see this line later from Shemot, okay? And besides, the land will also increase its produce and improve when it remains fallow for some time. So the Rambam's explanation for why do we not plant every seventh year is, again, very outcome oriented. He gives two explanations. One is it's a way of feeding the poor, and two, letting the land rest actually makes it more productive. Now, you might not do that unless the Torah told you to do it, but it turns out that it's for your own good. In the long run, it will lead to a more productive land if you let it rest every seventh year. That's the Rambam's view. Now let's go through the Chinuch's view. You're not going to be surprised that it's quite different. This is mitzvah number 84, Shemitah of the land, letting the land rest. I'm just going straight to Misharshei HaMitzvah. This is that kind of the second section where he talks about the roots of this commandment, to affix in our hearts and make a strong impression in our minds about the matter of the world having been created. Let's keep going. So that a person will remember that the land which produces fruits for him every year does not produce them by its own might and virtue, for there's a master over it, and over its master. And when he wishes, he commands him, that is the master of the land, to render them, that is the fruit, ownerless. Okay, so basically it's to remind us that there is a creator, that there's something above, and that the land is basically a gift from Hashem. And there's another benefit in this matter, to acquire the trait of letting go of one's possessions, for there's no one more generous than he who gives without hope for recompense. And there's another benefit. The outcome of this is that a person will add to his trust in God. Again, there's a lot here. I'm not going to, you can see, I'm trying to go through it quickly, but no doubt you get the sense that the Chinuch has a really different understanding of what Shemitah is about. The mitzvah of Shemitah for the Chinuch is not necessarily about better outcomes, better yields of crops, a better way of functioning society so that the poor have something to eat in the seventh year. Rather, it's about better character traits. The purpose of the mitzvah is to make us better people, to improve us by driving home a sense of appreciation for what we have and where it really comes from. That is, not just from our own labor, but from the true master of the universe, okay? So, by now, hopefully it's clear how these two opinions about what Shemitah is about, from Rambam in the Chinuch, mirror the debate that we saw from before about the rationales that they gave for Bal Tashri, also between Rambam and the Chinuch. In each case, the view of the Rambam seemed to be more about cost-benefit, more about consequences, and the view of the Chinuch seemed to be more about the messages that our actions have for the formation of proper character. Now, how did these great rabbis wind up with such different understandings of the same law? Okay, in the case of Shemitah, it's actually a little easier, perhaps, we don't know for sure, but perhaps, to see how each side came to their conclusions based on different psukim, because Shemitah is mentioned multiple times in the Torah, and then in the different places, if you kind of read them closely, Shemitah is actually described somewhat differently. Okay, so let's go through those just so we're all on the same page. So this is in the book of Shmot in Parshat Mishpatim. So the context here is we're talking about a whole series of laws in Mishpatim, right? But don't take bribes, don't oppress the stranger. These are really kind of like moral formulations, but like really laws of kind of managing society, you might say. And then it gets to Pasuk Yud. It says, V'shesh shamim tizrat artzecha. 6 years you will sow your land, V'asafta et tuata, and you will gather in its bounty, its yield. V'hashvi'it tishmetena. On the 7th year you let it rest. Unetashta, and it lies fallow. V'achlu evyonei amecha. So maybe you might say that Rambam, when he read this, again, this is speculation, but I don't think it's crazy to say, that this line at least seems to adhere more to Rambam's view. Why do you let the land, do you not work the land every 7th year? Two things. You should let it rest for whatever reason. The Rambam fills in the gap so that it's more higher yielding. And then so that the poor of your people will eat. That was the second explanation that the Rambam gave. Those are the two key points for the Rambam's answer. Why not plant every 7th year? Okay, contrast that. We're going to see that another place where Shemitah comes up. This is in the book of Vayikra, in Parshat Behar. And there just the language is very different. It says, Daber al bnei Israel v'amarta alehem, ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem, v'shavta haaretz Shabbat laHashem. Okay, when you enter the land that I'm going to give you, the land will rest a Shabbat of Hashem. Sheshanim tizra sadecha v'sheshanim tizmor karmecha v'asafta et tuata. Similar, for 6 years you sow your field and your vineyards. V'shana hashvi'it Shabbat Shabbaton yel haaretz, Shabbat laHashem. And this same language keeps coming up. Shabbaton yel haaretz, v'ayta Shabbat haaretz. I'm not going to go through all of it in detail, but what you get the sense of very quickly is that the language of Vayikra is very different. It's more Shabbat, 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 Shabbaton. What's Shabbat about after all? The Chinuch might say, if you were stressing more this source, this kind of formulation of what Shemitah is. What is Shabbat all about? It's to remind you that God created the world in 7 days and rested on the seventh, or at least that's one reason, okay? We rest on the seventh day, and we allow the land to rest, and the seventh year to remind us that everything we have comes from a higher source. Okay, this parallels the Chinuch's explanation of Bal Tashchit, why we shouldn't waste. We shouldn't waste because, again, it kind of teaches us an inner lesson about the world, having an appreciation for the world. And similarly, when it comes to Shemitah, we need to take the seventh year off because it's a Shabbat. You could say it's almost like a more ritual way of thinking about the law, that it wakes us to spiritual realities to help train our characters, to make us the kind of people who appreciate that we live in a world that God gave us and we should act accordingly. This is really different, again, than that kind of cost benefit for your own good way of explaining the law. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize. Hopefully this is clear, but just so we're all at the same place. Let's take stock. So we looked at 2 laws that have to do with the way in which the Torah tells people how to interact with trees, let's say, or with the natural world. Bal Tashchit, the law of not cutting down fruit trees during war, and the broader ways that the rabbis interpreted that to be broader, don't be wasteful, okay? And Shemitah, letting the land rest every 7th year. And in each case, we saw the Rishonim grappling with the meaning of these laws. In each case, there was one understanding that sounded more outcome-oriented. Don't cut down that tree because you might need it later, okay? Don't overwork the land now because you want it to be more fertile in the long run. Okay, in each case, we also saw there was an alternative explanation for the rationale of the law that sounds less about outcomes and more, I keep saying the realm of ritual, but meaning it's an expressive behavior that captures a spiritual message about the world. So, restrain yourself from destroying perfectly good trees, even in war. Why? To show that you understand that God put those lovely trees on the earth and they're not to be taken for granted. The goal is to train us to view the world as a gift, not simply ours to do with what we like. And similarly with Shemitah, don't work the land every 7th year. Why? To make the point that the land isn't truly ours. It belongs to something higher than us. It's not really ours, okay? So we never really know the reasons for the mitzvah. And perhaps it's not even right to to talk about the reason for a given mitzvah, right? Mitzvot are multifaceted. It's probably unfair to say what's the reason for a mitzvah, but nevertheless, this project of trying to suggest ta'amei mitzvot, reasons for mitzvot, has a long lineage. And because figuring out the ideas that stand behind the mitzvot is hard, it's not uncommon that we would see different rabbis taking different views, as we've seen with Bal Tashchit and with Shemitah. Okay, now, why? Okay, so let's take a step back. Okay, because we saw these 2 different ways of thinking about why the Torah gave us these laws. Okay, so I'm going to try to give a more modern formulation, and hopefully that will tie in both camps, you might say. Okay, why do we need the Torah to give us these laws? I'm just going to suggest that it seems that an ethic of conservation, right, a more modern way of saying it, isn't something that always comes to us naturally, okay? Or at least it's safe to say that people often lack a good natural sense of where to draw the line between what's being too sensitive versus not sensitive enough to matters related to how we use up scarce resources of the world around us, okay? And it seems that our natural instinct tends to be to err on the side of justifying ourselves when we do things that might be harmful to the world around us. It seems that we have to be acculturated to the idea that sometimes we actually have to restrain ourselves and to respect nature and to kind of keep ourselves, restrain ourselves more than we would naturally be inclined to do. That's actually why the Torah needs to step in and guide us to act in ways that we wouldn't have chosen if we were just left to ourselves. And maybe in like this is a homiletic sense, but maybe this is one thing that the Torah is getting at when it introduces the relationship between people and nature 2 times in Breshit, right? In Breshit 1 and Breshit 2. In Breshit 1, we know that it says that man was created B'Tselem Elokim, and then famously it says V'yivarech otam Elokim v'yomer lahem Elokim pru'ervu mil'u et haaretz v'kivshuha. Be fertile and increase and fill the earth, v'kivshuha, and master it, okay, and dominate over it. That's kind of chapter 1. You might, again, with this reading, think that's kind of like the baseline of what it is to be human in some way. But then you also have chapter 2, which tells the story in a slightly different way of Adam being placed in a garden. And in the garden, when Hashem puts him there, it says, "V'yikach Hashem Elokim et Adam v'yanichehu began Eden le'ovda u'leshomra." These are also famous words, right? The man was put in the garden to work it and to keep it. Different than the v'kivshuha. So I guess the way I'm trying to explain it is that if chapter 1 of, kind of humankind maybe is to say our first instinct is to dominate nature, then maybe only later in chapter 2, so to speak, we have to develop an ethic of being taught by Hashem to be a little bit more sensitive, to kind of develop this ethic of conservation. Okay, so the Torah gives us laws that teach us to be more sensitive in the way that we interact with nature, but toward what end? And as we've seen in the analysis of Bal Tashchit and Shemitah, it seems that these laws are meant to instill in us 2 different types of intuition. One stressed by Rambam, and another stressed by the Chinuch. Okay, so for the Rambam's understanding of the mitzvot, we learn that we need to train ourselves to take a longer view when we think about what's really in our own best interest. So that is to say, sure, I want to cut down the tree. I need the wood now. I need to win this war right now. And in fact, worrying about tomorrow is a luxury that you often don't have when you're in the middle of war. But if I'm not careful, as Rambam and even Ramban, even more so seems to be pointing out in that case, okay? If I'm not careful, I'll come to miss these great fruit trees when peacetime finally comes. Okay, that's one way of thinking about Bal Tashchit. And so too is Shemitah. If I want to eat, I need a farm. I want to max the productivity of my land. But sometimes allowing the land to rest actually helps boost my yield over time. That's part of what we're doing on Shemitah, at least according to Rambam. This line of thinking, as we saw, kind of thinks it's one intuition that by which you might develop an ethic of conservation. And that is that we need to train ourselves to take the long view of what our own self-interest is. And the long view often calls for restraint now. Okay, conservation now, so that we and our children will have more later. But we all know that when we're faced with an actual choice of what I want to do right now, or what might be better for me in the long run, we tend to be pretty good at rationalizing why it's okay to do what I want to do at this moment. And that's especially true when we're talking about situations where I'm just doing an action where if it was just me, it would actually be totally okay. The problem is that if we all do it, there's a broader impact. Okay, so like an example of this, it's funny. I was just in Vietnam over winter break, and we met these folks, and it was actually kind of a sad story. The fisherman was telling us about how his dad used to fish, and there were plenty of fish, and now everybody goes out with their nets, and the technology is so good that they've kind of run out of fish. The yields are very low. Okay, overfishing is a good example of this. So each fisherman goes out each morning, tries to catch as much as he can. He's not trying to harm anyone. He's just trying to bring back as much as he can for his family, right, to make a living. And if there was only one fisherman in the world, that would be fine. But if we all go out with our amazing boats and nets, we wind up in a bad spot. Okay, it's a tough situation. No one did anything wrong, and certainly no one acted out of any malice. Each person just did what made sense for that person as an individual, turns out that's not always good enough. Sometimes we need some higher order coordination to keep us in check beyond what we would do for ourselves as individuals, okay, or we wind up worse off. And our natural tendency, again, it seems to be to find excuses about why what we're doing is okay. And, so we kind of talk ourselves into why that's fine. And it seems that the Torah is aware of that. It seems Chazal were aware of that. So anyways, in one sense, or at least kind of for one message, the intuition has to be slow down, think about what's really in your long-term self-interest, maybe in our collective long-term self-interest. But maybe that's also only one of the two intuitions that we're meant to take. And the second one is a different intuition, and that's what the chinuch was kind of harping on. And I would say that is a sense of reverence that we need to develop. Okay, this is actually a little different. This is a sense that the world is a gift. It's not just there for us to exploit. It's a sense that the world's amazing, okay, and not to be wasted. And that intuition is put in a really different language. It's not the language of cost benefit, right? If you remember, the chinuch's words were way harsher. He says, I'm going to quote, says the root of this commandment is well known. It's in order to teach souls to love good, okay? And then he continues about, again, like the pious people would not even destroy a grain of mustard. This isn't the language of cost benefit analysis. It's the sense of reverence, of erring on the side of constraint, even erring in a way that seems like a chassid, like a little bit overly pious, you could say, okay? And so too of Shemitah. We take the 7th year off in order to give us perspective about our small place in a bigger creation, okay? Again, a very different language than cost benefit. It really is more the sense of reverence that you have when you look over the Grand Canyon and you realize how small you are. And if you were going to kind of mine it, you would feel differently afterwards, okay? So with that, I'd argue that this discussion among the Rishonim may be a model when we think about hard questions today also, because these questions about how we deal with the natural world, they're hard enough questions that they don't just go away, and you kind of need a language. Sometimes it's helpful, and we're lucky to have the collective wisdom of people who came before us and a language that we can use for trying to think about how to live today. So kind of get to the end and sum this up a little bit. I would argue that you need both of these intuitions, okay? Intuition one, that you need to take the long-term view. And that's one way of saying it, right? In that sense, these laws are really there for you. They're there to focus you on the bigger picture in a way that you might not do on your own if you weren't commanded. I'm sure you're giving up something now, but it's really for you in the long run. Intuition two is a little different. That's develop a sense of reverence for your place in something bigger. And that's a counterweight to your natural inclination to justify why the cost benefit analysis just seems to go your way more often than it might, okay? Sometimes the law is there actually not to cater to you, but kind of to change you, to change how you think about things. And that's presumably how the chinuch thought about these laws, right? It's to actually have you view yourself differently in this world. And once you view yourself in that way, you will come to act in a different way, okay? Now these days, okay, so that's kind of the context. These days, it happens to be, there's a lot of politics around everything, it seems, and environmental matters are no different. Often they're at the top of the news. And I would just say, just kind of to close, that when it comes to hard questions, we find that people come at them from different points of view. And when these discussions about, kind of trade-offs come up, I at least think about, myself talking to people that I know. Some people that I would talk to would tend to be moved more by a language of cost benefit. The way that they think about these issues tends to stress more a utilitarian lens when they think about the environment, about conservation. They tend to think about it in terms of cost benefit. And that, again, is a language that is available to us in our tradition. Other people seem to have just a different way of thinking about it, and a different way of talking about these issues. It's a more moralistic language. It's more of a discussion of how small we are in some broader natural world, a language of reverence. Again, we also have that in our tradition. I think it's valuable that we have both of them in our tradition, because kind of to take it all the way back, and with this I'll close, we started by talking about why is Torah called a tree? And the idea was that we all bring something of ourselves to the study of Torah. And that's why it is that you learn much from your teachers, more from your friends, and most from your students. That we all contribute in our own way, in that we all are like those trees that kind of started from a different place, and we're all reaching for the same thing above, kind of the same source of our energy, of our spiritual energy, let's say, but we reach at it from different approaches, and those can all be l'shem shamayim. Okay, so hopefully this gives us a little bit more to think about as we celebrate trees this month, to be mindful of nature, to be inspired by nature, and maybe most importantly, to find ways to learn from each other, even as we kind of work at the same difficult problems, each of us from our own starting point. Okay, thanks everyone.